Good evening. I wanted to make tonight's video, lecture number 20, a very short video about foreign affairs in the 1950s, and particularly the CIA involvement in those foreign affairs in the 1950s. This shouldn't be a very long lecture, a very short little section here to cover. During the Eisenhower administration, which is 1953 to 1961, there's some rethinking about foreign affairs as they had been done under the previous administration. And so there's some new things that show up here that are going to be at least for the rest of the 1950s and even part of the 1960s, part of the foreign policy handbook. One was something called Pactomania. You'll recall that under NSC 68, one of the suggestions there had been for collective security arrangements to be made with as many other nations as possible. And so we'll see this all throughout the 1950s. With a multitude of other nations, including the Philippines, New Zealand, Australia, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, much of Southeast Asia, Taiwan, West Germany, Pakistan, and so on. And remember, a collective security arrangement means that an attack on one member is in fact an attack on all members. So the U.S. is going to sign many of these collective security arrangements during the 1950s. Second thing that we're going to see in the Eisenhower Foreign Affairs Department is a cutback on the conventional military force, that is to say, all non-nuclear military force, and an increase in the nuclear arsenal. Reliance on covert operations, which is where the CIA is going to come in, and going hand in hand with number 3, the Cold War shifting to the Third World. Right, and this happens for a number of reasons. Nobody wants another war in Europe. We've already had 2 in the 20th century. Nobody's really interested in a third. Certainly the Europeans themselves are not interested in another war in Europe itself. third world nations are unstable, and so it's generally cheaper and easier to manipulate them. Now, part of the reason third world nations are unstable is due to what is called decolonization. At the end of 1945, this is how the world was still colonized. The British still had a great deal of control of Africa, India. If we count the British dominions, we throw in Canada, parts of southern Africa, and some more parts of Australia down here. France, big chunks of Africa, French Indochina. Portugal, still having a few bits and pieces. Spain, still having one, two little pieces. The Netherlands, still having some bits and pieces over here. Belgium, still having the Congo. Of course, the United States, still having primarily the Philippines, and a little bit of things here and here. Decolonization is the collapse of the empires. All of these empires that you see here in this map here in 1945 are going to begin to collapse. In the 1950s and 1960s. And some of these empires had existed for over a century. France and Britain had carved up Africa back in the 1800s. Of course, Britain had had a hold of India since around the time of the American Revolution. The U.S. had, of course, been holding on to the Philippines since 1902. So what we're going to see here is a lot of these empires fall apart in the 1950s and 1960s. Sometimes it's relatively peaceful. Most of the time it's not. There's going to be wars fought as the French try to hold on to part of their African empire, as the French try to hold on to Indochina, which is not going to go well for them. That's a story we'll look at in Unit 4. The British will also find themselves in a few places also dealing with uprisings as their empire begins to collapse. These empires are collapsing partially for financial reasons. Remember, Great Britain pretty much came out of World War II broke and heavily in debt. France as well came out financially strapped. But a lot of decolonization also came from the idea of self-determination, that people who lived in these areas decided that they no longer wanted to be colonies, that they wanted to control their own destinies, not be a part of somebody else's empire. How this contributes to the instability of the third world, because much, again, of the Cold War is going to shift into the third world. When Britain, France, and some of the others left these areas, they did not necessarily leave stable governments behind. And so that's going to be problematic. They often not only do not leave a stable government, but a lot of times they don't leave people who are prepared in any way for self-governance at all. If you look at the United States, when the United States became its own nation after being a part of the British for 150 years, we had our own universities, we had systems of trade, we had a system of law in place, all those type of things. And we had practiced self-government for a long time before we actually broke from the British Empire. These places have not had that luxury. India has somewhat, there has been somewhat limited government by the people of India for themselves, very limited. But in a lot of these places, there had not really been the chance of real self-determination as part of the empires. And so these nations are coming out basically with no real experience in how to run a government, how to maintain a government, and that's going to make it very easy. And a lot of them are also dirt fucking poor as well, and so that's going to make it very easy for both the Americans and the Soviets to slip in there with money and other methods of manipulation and turn these parts of the world into a battleground for Cold War. So we're going to look at a couple examples of that today, and how the CIA in particular really scored some successes in the 1950s in the third world, and taking advantage of the sort of instability of the third world. The first one we're going to look at has to do with Iran, and then the second one has to do with Guatemala. Now, Iran was an independent nation of sorts. But all the oil in Iran was controlled by the British. And after World War II, Britain still continued to control Iran's oil. And we're talking millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that the British are taking out of Iran and leaving really only a pittance for the Iranians themselves. In addition to this, which we'll call unfair profit sharing, the British had set up a system of segregation in Iran. There were hospitals that only the British were allowed to use, restaurants, recreational facilities, swimming pools, and so on. So the British, again, who are a minority in Iran, have set up a system of segregation in Iran, despite being the minority. Now, there's no telling how long this situation would have continued, but in roughly 1950, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached a 50-50 split for oil. And this caused the Iranians to decide they'd had enough of the British. So in 1951, Iran nationalized their oil fields. Now, nationalization simply means that the government takes over an industry. In this case, oil. Later on in the 1960s, Iraq will nationalize their oil. Okay, so that just means that basically the government seizes control of some type of industry. Negotiations broke down. The U.S. did try to get Iran and Great Britain to come to a new agreement. This led to a boycott of Iran's oil, which began to sink the Iranian economy. Again, oil was pretty much Iran's only commodity. And with a boycott by the Western powers, there was really no one left to sell to. Now, the Americans initially didn't care about Iran losing its oil, about Britain losing the oil fields. The problem where the United States began to get interested in what was going on had to do with Iran's prime minister. Mohammed Mossadegh. In order to keep his country financially afloat, he borrowed money from the Soviet Union. And, to the United States, this began looking like Soviets were going to get a foothold in Iran. And remember the domino theory. If Iran falls to communism, well, then that could mean Iraq, that could mean Saudi Arabia, that could mean the entire Middle East falling to communism. And so, again, that's that whole domino theory thing. So the British want their oil back. The Americans want Mossadegh back, or they want him out. So in 1953, CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt sent to Iran he does a couple of things there. He hires mobs to demonstrate in Iran, specifically in the capital, Tehran. This cost about $200,000 to accomplish. He also began meeting with, to be more specific here, Iran's army to overthrow Mossadegh. And he also began grooming a new leader for Iran. This would be the Shah of Iran. Mohammad Pahlavi. Everybody just knows him as the Shah of Iran. Okay? Even I always forget what his actual name was. So it's just Shah of Iran is good enough. So August of 1953. There's a coup against Mossadegh, who is overthrown and arrested. The Shah is put into power. Redivides. Is that a word? Redivides. Maybe I hyphenate it. And then the Shah redivides the oil in Iran with, and you don't need to know these numbers, but America gets 40%, Britain gets 40%, the Dutch get 14%, the French get whatever's left, and then 50% of the profits go back to Iran. So it's a 50-50 split with the Iranians. And again, this whole thing probably cost somewhere in the neighborhood of around $225,000 to overthrow an elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, and replace him with the Shah of Iran, who we'll hear more about later in the 1970s. Needless to say, the Shah, he'll become one of those dictators that the U.S. is willing to work with as long as he is anti-communist. So we'll see how well that works out for him later on. This was so successful that in 1954, the CIA decided to take its little show to Guatemala. Guatemala, it's down here. Here is Mexico. Here is the Yucatan. So there is Guatemala. I'll just give you an idea of where we're at. Guatemala, for a long time, had been ruled by one of those sort of classic Latin American dictators. But that guy had been overthrown in the 1940s. The Guatemalans had started holding elections. I don't know where they got that idea from. This is who they elected, Jacobo, never pronounce it correctly, Arbenz. Section in here so I can do a little typing. Jacobo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Arbenz had been elected. He decided to take on the real power in Guatemala. And the real power in Guatemala was United Fruit, or as the Guatemalans referred to it, El Popo, the octopus. United Fruit had basically been screwing over the Guatemalans for decades at this point. And President Arbenz decided that wasn't going to fly anymore. And so a couple of things happened. First of all, the government seized 26,000 acres of United Fruit land to give to the peasants. Eventually, that number would jack up to 1.5 million acres. And United Fruit also needed to pay $650,000 in back wages. Now, again, this is called nationalization. And it's the kind of things that go on in communist countries. Now, was Arbenz a communist? No. but he's close enough as far as the CIA is concerned. I also need to point out that United Fruit Company was represented by a law firm, and two of the members of the law firm I guess they were absent members because they were serving in government. One was the head of the CIA, and the other was the Secretary of State. And so you can see here, this is John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, and whose law firm represented United Fruit. This is President Eisenhower. You can kind of see which way this is going to go for the Guatemalans here. I don't really have to draw you a picture of it. And then the guy's brother was the head of the CIA, and so you can imagine how that's going as well. If Arbenz wasn't a communist, he was close enough, and so the CIA decided he had to go. Having had success the year before in tossing out Iran's prime minister, the CIA simply decided to do the same thing here in Guatemala. So here's what they did. Guatemala, always misspelling it. Okay. First of all, the United States fixed it so that nobody would sell weapons to Guatemala. Meanwhile, U.S. sold weapons sold a shitload of weapons to Guatemala's neighbors. Okay? And you don't have to be a tactical genius to figure out what's next. Arbenz couldn't buy weapons. Arbenz felt that he needed to defend his country. So Arbenz, if he can't buy weapons from the United States or its allies, who can he buy weapons from? Soviets and their allies. So Arbenz buys weapons from Poland, communist country. So as far as the United States is concerned, here's proof that this guy is a communist. He bought weapons from communists because we wouldn't sell him weapons. Okay. Oh, this feels like entrapment. Anyway, June of 1954, Arbenz is overthrown. Arbenz was more of a nationalist who wanted his country free from United Fruit. But as far as the United States was concerned, that made him a communism. The fun thing about this particular coup is that all the records from it have been released by the CIA. And so we can see here 85 members of the Armas group received training, 260 men in Honduras and El Salvador, air operations. There's another sheet that I don't have loaded. There was a list of names that the CIA, people living in Guatemala that the CIA was interested in. It's just you don't know if they're interested in them to arrest them or kill them or what. And the problem is all the names have been blacked out. So you have no idea of who these people were or what happened to them. Other than that, they appeared on a particular troublemaker list prepared by the CIA. Now, these are the only successes the CIA has in the 1950s. They're going to totally bungle several other things. And when they try to take this particular overthrow the guy in charge show to Cuba later on in the 1960s, it's not going to go so well. I'm going to talk a few things about the 1950s. I want to get us right up to the civil rights movement, and then that'll prepare us for lecture number 21. The vision we have of the 1950s is pretty much based on, well, the vision that we have is based a lot on TVs and movies. But much of it is true. The 1950s were a time of affluence. By 1955, 60% of the U.S. population was middle class, which was defined by the government as a net salary, that is after taxes, $5,000 per year. If you made that much money after taxes, you were considered middle class. 60% of the country was there by 1955. 25% of the population had moved out to the suburbs. So again, much of what you've seen on Happy Day, if any of you have ever watched Days, much of that is rooted in reality. Much of this affluence was helped along by the federal government. I also want to point out that the number of cars in the U.S. increased 133% between 1945 and 1960. A lot of this influence is sort of undergirded by a very decisive role played by the federal government. Okay. First thing, GI Bill. After World War II, maybe during World War II, Congress had decided that veterans were going to qualify for education loans, home loans, small business loans, housing loans. Yeah. So a lot of these people who are moving out to the suburbs are, I guess, housing loan and home loans, the same thing, are moving out there, borrowing money. Their loans are being supported by the federal government. And again, you have to remember, before World War II, if you wanted to buy a house, you had to put half the money up front. The other half had to be paid in 5 years. So a lot of Americans did not own houses before World War II. With the federal government coming in, loan periods get longer. So you only have to come up with 10 or 20%, and you have a much longer time to pay off. Education loans for college, education loans for vocational training. If you don't want to go to college, you want to open a business or learn a trade, government's there. Small business loans as well. Okay. National Highway Act of 1956, 41,000 miles of interstate. Interstate 20, Interstate 10, Interstate 35, and all those lovely interstates built by the federal government, $32 billion. Okay? And that is jobs, and those jobs are people taking their check, buying their homes, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And then finally, government-sponsored research and development. The government in the 1950s and moving forward put a lot of money into places like General Electric, IBM, places like that to develop new technology. And much of that technology eventually wound up in the domestic sphere. If you think about, for instance, the chip, the name has escaped me. The chip, it's in all the computers and what like that. That was funded with government money, research and development in that. The internet was essentially created by the government in order to connect research labs with each other. And so, again, the government is pouring a bunch of money into research and development, computer chips, all sorts of other technology that's going to find its way into domestic life as well. And a lot of the people working at General Electric or at IBM are engineers and researchers who went to college on the federal government's education programs. And now the federal government is providing the money for them to be employed as well. So again, the federal government is playing a massive role in this affluence that is growing throughout the 1950s. All right, putting people to work, either directly, indirectly, putting people in the homes, putting people into their own businesses, and so on and so forth. Here we see the building of Levittowns, the suburbs that began to spring up all throughout the 1950s. The original Levittown in New Jersey. Again, the increase in car culture. Ooh, there's a school in the whatever suburban nightmare this is. And with the suburbs come the shopping and all the other stuff. So again, this ripple effect from a lot of this government money that's being spent will ripple out and out and out and out. Now, there were problems underneath the sort of glittering affluence of the 1950s. Okay. Some of those problems we'll look at in more detail, but obviously civil rights. When we talk about the affluence of the 1950s, it did not extend as much to non-white America as it did. There were pockets, certainly, in places like Detroit and other places where there's a sizable black middle class beginning to develop, but certainly not at the pace of the white middle class. not all women were happy in this new world. A lot of women had worked in the 1940s. They had enjoyed the independence of having a job, having their own money, living in the city, going to college. So for a lot of women, this, in the 1940s, they're building tanks. In the 1950s, they're shuttling their kids around. In the 1940s, they're at university, and now all of a sudden they're out in the suburbs. For some women, this was fine. My grandmother grew up in an orphanage in Scotland. She didn't come to the United States until after World War II. So something like this is heaven on earth for old Granny Elkins. My other grandmother grew up in what were essentially, the projects. And so to have a home, to have all these modern appliances was very much okay with them. But again, there is discontent amongst women, not all women, but some women. We do see increasing rates of alcoholism amongst women in the 1950s, and increasing what we would today call prescription drug abuse amongst women as well. So again, for some women, things were fine just the way they were, but for others, not necessarily. TV did not do a great job in terms of helping women. If you go back and watch those old TV shows from the 50s, wow, look at that 12-inch screen. None of the moms work. None of them have anything, have any lives of their own outside of their husband and their children. In fact, if you watch those old 50s TV shows, when the mother is on the phone talking to one of her friends, she is talking about either her husband or her children, never talking about herself. So again, TV really didn't do a very good job of presenting the kind of role models perhaps that younger girls could look up to, and certainly showed that the ideal woman was, back in the kitchen. Again, when the women leave the house, again, women who were building B-29 bombers in World War II, if they left the house to go downtown, they got completely lost, and had to be rescued by their husbands. So again, it's not a particularly forward-thinking way of being. Some other problems. Techno fear, all the new technology, because the same technology that turns on your coffee maker in the morning is the same technology that's being used to build guidance systems for nuclear weapons. And so there's this fear that maybe technology is getting a little bit ahead of us. Okay? And you see this a lot, particularly in science fiction of the 1950s, where the technology is clearly, the question is, can we rather than should we? There's a fear that nobody's asking the question, should we? They're just asking the question, can we? And so there was definitely a techno fear there, that all this more and more technology might wind up destroying us. This whole techno fear kind of got a shot in the arm when the Soviets put Sputnik up into space. Sputnik, seen here, was launched by the Soviets, and there are two Sputniks. I'm really just talking about the first one here, but they did it twice. But when Sputnik popped up in October of 1957, let's not also forget the Soviets were the first people to put a man in orbit. The Soviets were the first people to send an object to the moon. Now, it crashed on the moon, but they at least got it there. And so there began to be this real fear that Soviets were in fact winning the technology race, because if the Soviets could put this into orbit, and chances are they're pretty far ahead. With the development of the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. You have to remember, all of our other threats of using nuclear weapons, and the time that we actually did, the two times we actually flew the nuclear weapon to the target. What everybody wanted to create was a way that we could launch a nuclear weapon from our country and hit the Soviet Union. That is what the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile is. And the fact that the Soviets put this thing into orbit freaked everybody out. The Soviets were actually winning the race to build the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. In reality, they were never close to beating us with the ICBM. Okay? But that's not something we found out about until decades later. In reality, the Soviets, in terms of nuclear technology, were never close to the United States. So, looks like the Soviets are winning the space race. Looks like they're winning the arms race. Civil rights we'll cover next week. We'll see some of these things come back again in the 1960s and 1970s. There's going to be a women's movement. There'll be an effort to make TV somewhat more reflective of the reality of society. Right. I still don't know how this was going to protect you from an atomic bomb, but here we go. All right, so the next lecture, which will be on Monday, we'll just cover civil rights. And then that'll be it for this unit. We'll actually push Cuba to Vietnam back into Unit 4. Now I'm going to watch this video in order to make sure it actually worked. It recorded everything. It did not stop somewhere through. Okay, so that's all for tonight.